Good afternoon. This is Michael Gordon, and this is my briefing for Business 625, Case 4. I chose question number 1. Some messages involve good news for some audiences, yet bad news for other audiences. What does this imply about how Weymouth should send its messages? Weymouth should send a single message, and that's what this question implies. The single message would include messages for all audiences involving the layoffs. It would explain the layoffs for the employees that aren't leaving, and explain the layoffs for the employees that are being laid off. The first thing I did in answering this question is did an audience analysis and looked at all the different audiences that Weymouth must address with this single message. The first audience is the employees being laid off. The second audience is the employees not being laid off. The third audience is the managers of employees that have to communicate the layoffs to employees being laid off and have to have a stake in deciding the communication for the layoffs. And finally, the last audience are investors and the public with Weymouth, who are going to interpret the message that Weymouth sends. The second thing I did was looked at the channels available for communication. Weymouth has multiple channels available and not just the 2 newsletters. They do have the Metal News and Open Hearth, but they also have the ability to provide a teleconference, send email, and then the face-to-face communication between managers and employees. What I did was I used the change communication model to look at the way Weymouth should craft its message so that a single message can reach out to all the different audiences. So the first item in the model is why the change must occur. Weymouth must include in the message the reasons why the change should occur. In this case, Weymouth needs to lay off employees to cut costs, to be able to invest more capital in plants to become more competitive with other competitors. In addition, in a downturn, Weymouth's revenues have gone down, giving them less free cash to do these investments. How will the change help Weymouth? The change will help Weymouth by becoming more competitive. By laying off a small number of employees now and upgrading plants, Weymouth should be able to compete better in the future and guarantee the jobs of the remaining employees. Why are opposing arguments inferior? In this case, opposing arguments are inferior because Weymouth needs to execute the layoffs. If Weymouth doesn't execute the layoffs, it appears that the company might be in jeopardy of becoming uncompetitive, and in that case, all of the jobs in the company could be lost instead of just a few. What could happen if the change doesn't occur? If the layoffs do not occur, then Weymouth can't do the capital investment in new plants and become more competitive to continue operation and to continue success in the future. The tools that the Weymouth has available are the channels of communication. So what Weymouth must do is craft a message and then decide which channels to send the communication on. Weymouth should send the communication internally on as many channels as possible so that all employees, those being laid off and those not being laid off, will get the message. Then soon after, Weymouth should send an external message through a press release or other means so that investors don't receive this message through a rumor mill or through disgruntled employees posting the message online. The next thing Weymouth must do in the message is say why this is optimistic. One of the most important things in this message that Weymouth should send to employees is that benefits are actually increasing for the employees who are not being laid off. Weymouth should emphasize this and make sure that employees understand that if they're not being laid off, then benefits are not only being increased, but so are salaries. This is also a good time to highlight the fact that Weymouth is actually taking the savings from the layoffs and putting it into upgraded plants to become more competitive. Weymouth is trying to invest in the future so that people will have jobs in the future. Finally, Weymouth should also communicate how the performance should be evaluated based on the layoffs. Weymouth is executing these layoffs for a specific reason, which means they should set a bar and evaluate how these layoffs will affect future performance. Then Weymouth can compare the expectations versus the actual performance and see if the layoffs were successful. And lastly, Weymouth should also send a message of how it understands the employees' positions. Weymouth has already done some layoffs by laying off hourly employees. In this specific round of layoffs with salaried employees, Weymouth has cut open positions, and they've also offered early retirement to some employees. In this case, Weymouth is trying to make the layoffs as painless as possible and lay off as few full-time employees as possible. Weymouth should communicate this in the message so employees who are being laid off and those not being laid off understand that Weymouth has done everything it can to keep their jobs. Finally, Weymouth needs to consider how each audience will receive the message. The employees being laid off are going to be negative about the message. The employees not being laid off will be both negative and positive. They'll be worried about their jobs and worried if Weymouth can continue operations, but they should also be positive about the fact that their benefits are increasing. It's this dichotomy between employees being laid off and not being laid off that the message affects, and which is why it's good news for one audience but bad news for another. The next audience that will react to this are investors. They should be generally positive about a message that Weymouth's trying to become more competitive, but could also be negative because they might be worried about Weymouth not being able to operate in the future, and this is just a tale of things to come. And finally, the managers, which are a very key component of this message. Managers will have to deliver the message personally to employees being laid off. In that case, Weymouth should get the managers on board as early as possible with this message, maybe even before sending the message to general employees. So to sum up, Weymouth should send a single message and that multiple audiences will receive the message differently. In order for Weymouth to make sure that the reaction of each audience is what the company wants, Weymouth should think about what each audience will do to react to the message and include information in the message that's relevant to each audience. Some audiences, such as employees being laid off, will probably want to know the reason and won't be happy about the message. Others, like the employees not being laid off, will have a stake in what the message includes involving benefits changes and if further layoffs will happen in the future.